On the ship's gala night, the waitress froze when she realized the millionaire was her husband, who died 13 years ago. She approached and the crystal chandeliers of the Ocean Majesty's grand ballroom cast dancing shadows across Caroline's uniform as she weaved between tables laden with caviar and conversation. At 37, she'd learned to move like water through crowds of wealth, invisible, essential, forgotten. The moment she passed, 2 years aboard this floating palace had taught her that much. More champagne for table 12, she murmured to herself, balancing the silver tray with practiced ease. The Dom Pérignon caught the light like liquid gold, each bubble a tiny star rising to burst at the surface. Around her, the elite mingled in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos, their laughter mixing with the gentle hum of the ship's engines far below. Caroline had stopped feeling sorry for herself long ago. This job paid better than anything she'd found in those forgotten small towns where she'd spent a decade hunched over a sewing machine, squinting at hems and buttons until her eyes burned. Here, the tips from a single evening could cover Emily's school supplies for a month. That's all that mattered. Emily. Excuse me, miss. A woman with diamonds dripping from her neck gestured impatiently. We've been waiting ages for service. Of course, ma'am. Right away. Caroline smiled, the practiced smile she'd perfected. Polite, apologetic, invisible. She filled their glasses with the efficiency of someone who understood that speed meant survival in this world. The ballroom buzzed with the usual mix of languages: French from the European aristocrats, accented English from the London set, rapid Spanish from the South American oil magnates. Caroline had picked up enough phrases over the years to catch fragments of conversations about art auctions, private jets, and summer homes in places she'd never see. She was refilling glasses at the VIP section when she heard it, a laugh that made her blood turn to ice water in her veins. Deep, familiar, with that slight rasp that used to make her heart race when she was 24 and stupid enough to believe in forever. The champagne flute slipped from her fingers. Time seemed to slow as the crystal tumbled toward the marble floor. But her reflexes kicked in just in time. She caught it an inch from disaster, her heart hammering against her ribs. The elderly gentleman at the table barely glanced up from his conversation about Swiss banking, oblivious to her near breakdown. Caroline forced herself to breathe. She was imagining things. Grief did that sometimes, even after 13 years, even after she'd finally accepted that Richard Sullivan was never coming home from that rainy night, when his car went off the bridge into Eagle River. But when she looked up, scanning the crowd with desperate eyes, she saw him, Richard, alive, breathing, laughing at something a stunning brunette whispered in his ear. He looked older, of course. The boyish face she'd fallen in love with had sharpened into aristocratic angles. His hair, once disheveled and forever falling into his eyes, was now perfectly styled and shot through with distinguished silver. The threadbare jeans and band t-shirts had been replaced by a tuxedo that probably cost more than she made in 6 months. But it was him. She'd know those green eyes anywhere, even if they now held a coldness she'd never seen before. Richard, she whispered, the name falling from her lips like a prayer. He stood near the orchestra, his arm around a woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a magazine, all sleek hair and perfect teeth and jewelry that caught the light like tiny suns. The nameplate on their table read, Mr. Alexander Grant and Mrs. Victoria Whitmore. Alexander Grant. The name meant nothing to her, but everything about the man wearing it meant everything. Caroline's legs moved without her permission, carrying her across the ballroom like a sleepwalker. She bumped into a waiter carrying a tray of canapes, apologized without hearing her own words, pushed through clusters of conversation. The champagne sloshed in her tray, but she barely noticed. Richard, she said it louder this time, standing just behind him. He turned, and for a split second, just a heartbeat, she saw recognition flash across his features. Then his face went blank, politely confused, like she was a stranger asking for directions. I'm sorry, he said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. Do we know each other? The question hit her like a physical blow. Richard, it's me, Caroline, your wife. The woman beside him, Victoria, raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. Alexander, darling, who is this? I have no idea. He looked Caroline up and down with the kind of dismissive glance reserved for particularly persistent salespeople. "I think you've mistaken me for someone else, Miss Hayes." The word came out strangled. "Caroline Hayes. But it used to be Sullivan, Mrs. Richard Sullivan." Something flickered in his eyes, so quick she almost missed it. Then he leaned closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne, expensive and unfamiliar. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, meant for her ears alone. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but it ends now. You will stay away from me, away from my fiancé, and away from my life. If you don't, you'll find out exactly how unpleasant I can make things for a nobody like you." Caroline felt like she was drowning in open air. "But Emily, she's your daughter, Richard. My name is Alexander Grant." His smile never wavered, but his eyes were arctic. "I've never seen you before in my life, and if you continue to harass me and my fiancé, I'll have security remove you from this ship." "Alexander," Victoria's voice held a note of concern. "Is everything all right? Just a confused staff member." "Darling," he straightened, his public face sliding back into place like a well-fitted mask. "Nothing to worry about." Caroline stood there, champagne tray trembling in her hands, as he turned away from her like she was nothing, like 13 years of marriage, of love, of shared dreams had never existed, like Emily had never existed. The conversations around her seemed to grow louder, the laughter more shrill, the chandeliers spun overhead like carnival lights. She needed to move, needed to breathe, needed to think, but her feet felt rooted to the marble floor. "Miss," a security guard appeared at her elbow. "Is there a problem here?" Caroline looked up into his concerned face, then back at Richard. Alexander, whatever he was calling himself, he was whispering something to Victoria, his hand possessively on her back, completely ignoring the woman whose world he'd just shattered. "No," Caroline managed. "No problem at all." She turned and walked away on unsteady legs, the champagne glasses chiming softly against each other like funeral bells. Behind her, she could hear Richard's laugh again. That same laugh that used to fill their tiny apartment, that used to make her feel like the luckiest woman alive. Now it sounded like the cruelest joke ever told. Caroline's hands shook so violently she could barely grip the service elevator's rail as it descended to the crew quarters. The champagne glasses clinked together like chattering teeth, and she pressed her lips tight to keep from screaming. The elevator's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, harsh and unforgiving after the soft golden glow of the ballroom. "Richard is alive. Richard is alive, and he pretended not to know me." The thought circled her mind like a vulture, picking at the edges of everything she thought she knew about her life. 13 years. 13 years of believing she was a widow, of struggling alone, of telling Emily bedtime stories about her daddy who was watching over them from heaven. All lies. The elevator shuddered to a stop on Deck C, and Caroline stumbled into the narrow corridor that led to the crew quarters. The contrast was jarring. Upstairs, all marble and crystal and endless space. Down here, industrial carpet and fluorescent lights and walls so close you could touch both sides if you stretched your arms wide. She needed to find Maggie. If anyone would listen without judgment, without questions, she couldn't answer. It would be Margaret Lee. Caroline had met Maggie on her first day aboard the Ocean Majesty 2 years ago. The older woman had taken one look at Caroline's second-hand uniform and the way she kept touching her wedding ring like a talisman, and had somehow understood without being told that here was another woman who'd learned to survive by keeping her head down and her mouth shut. Maggie's cabin was at the end of the hall, and Caroline knocked with trembling knuckles. "Come in, honey." Maggie's voice carried through the thin door. Warm as always, Caroline pushed inside to find Maggie sitting on her narrow bunk, removing her sensible work shoes with the careful movements of someone whose feet had carried her through countless 12-hour shifts. At 58, Margaret Lee had been working cruise ships for over 20 years, moving from vessel to vessel like a nomad of the seas. Her graying hair was always pulled back in a practical bun, and her weathered hands told the story of decades spent changing sheets and scrubbing bathrooms for people who never bothered to learn her name. "Caroline, honey, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." The word hit too close to home. Caroline sank into the room's single chair, her legs finally giving out. "Maggie, I need to tell you something, And I need you to promise me you won't think I've lost my mind." Maggie's expression shifted from concern to complete attention. She'd seen enough heartbreak in her years to recognize the real thing when it walked through her door. "Talk to me. My husband." Caroline's voice cracked. "The one I told you about, Richard. He's not dead." Maggie leaned forward. "Honey, what do you mean?" "He's here. On this ship right now. I saw him at the gala." The words tumbled out in a rush. "But he's not Richard anymore. He's calling himself Alexander Grant, and he's with some socialite named Victoria Whitmore. And when I tried to talk to him, he pretended he'd never seen me before in his life." Maggie's face went very still. "Alexander Grant." Something in her tone made Caroline look up sharply. "You know him." "I know of him." Maggie stood and moved to her small desk, pulling out a tablet she used to keep track of passenger preferences and room assignments. "Been cleaning his suite for 3 days now. Presidential suite on deck A, real high roller. Drops more on wine than I make in a month." She tapped at the screen, frowning. "But Caroline, honey, are you absolutely sure? I mean, 13 years is a long time. And sometimes when we're grieving, it was him." Caroline's voice was rock solid. "I would know Richard Sullivan if he was wearing a Halloween mask. That's my husband up there. Maggie, the father of my daughter. And he looked at me like I was dirt on his shoe." Maggie studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Okay, if you say it was him, then it was him. But that raises a whole lot of questions, doesn't it?" The floodgates opened then. Caroline told her everything. About the car accident that wasn't an accident. About the closed casket funeral. About the insurance money that barely covered the burial costs. About the years of struggling to keep food on the table while Emily asked why Daddy couldn't visit from heaven. About the job at Henderson's tailor shop where she'd sewn until her fingers bled. Then the move to Murphy's Alterations where the pay was better but the hours longer. "I worked 3 jobs some months," Caroline whispered. "Emily wore secondhand clothes to school and ate cereal for dinner more nights than I can count. And all this time, he was alive, building some new life as Alexander Grant." Maggie listened without interruption, her weathered hands folded in her lap. When Caroline finally fell silent, Maggie reached over and squeezed her shoulder. "First thing we need to figure out," Maggie said, her voice gentle but practical, "is who Alexander Grant really is. Because if your Richard took his name, then what happened to the real Alexander Grant?" The question sent a chill down Caroline's spine. "You think Richard did something to him?" "I think a man who fakes his own death and abandons his wife and child is capable of more than we might want to believe." Maggie stood and moved to a small safe bolted to the wall behind her bed. "I've got access to the passenger manifest database. Part of my job is knowing who's staying in which suite, their preferences, any special requests. Let me see what I can find about Mr. Grant's history with the cruise line." Caroline watched as Maggie's fingers flew over the tablet screen. The older woman's brow furrowed deeper with each passing minute. "This is interesting," Maggie muttered. "Alexander Grant first booked with our company exactly 13 years ago, March 2011. Booked a Mediterranean cruise out of Barcelona. Paid cash for a presidential suite, March 2011. 3 weeks after Richard's supposed death. What about before that?" Caroline asked. "That's just it. There's nothing before that. No booking history. No customer profile. Nothing. It's like Alexander Grant just appeared out of thin air 13 years ago with enough money to book the most expensive suite on the ship." Caroline's mouth went dry. Could you get access to his room, not to steal anything?" she added quickly. "Just to look around. Maybe there's something that proves who he really is." Maggie was quiet for a long moment, staring at the tablet screen. When she looked up, her eyes were troubled but determined. "I could," she said slowly. "I'm scheduled to service the presidential suites tomorrow morning while the passengers are at the morning activities. But Caroline, if we're right about this, if your Richard really did take another man's identity, we could be dealing with someone dangerous. He already threatened me," Caroline said. "Told me to stay away or he'd make things unpleasant for me. Then we need to be smart about this." Maggie stood and began pacing the small space. "If we're going to expose him, we need proof. Real proof. Not just your word against his." Caroline thought about Richard's cold eyes, about the way he'd looked through her like she was invisible. He chose this ship on purpose, didn't he? He knew I worked here. Seems likely. Question is why, if he wanted to stay dead, why risk coming face to face with you? The answer hit Caroline like a punch to the stomach. Because he wants to make sure I stay quiet. Maybe he's worried I'll figure out he's alive and cause problems for his new life. Or maybe, Maggie said quietly, he's planning to make sure you can't cause problems for anyone ever again. The words hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Caroline thought about Emily. Safe in her dorm room at the boarding school Caroline had worked double shifts to afford. At least her daughter was far away from whatever this was about to become. We need to find out who Alexander Grant really was, Caroline said. And we need to find out what Richard did to him. Maggie nodded grimly. Tomorrow morning, when I clean his suite, if there's evidence to find, I'll find it. What if he catches you? Honey, Maggie said with a slight smile that didn't reach her eyes. I've been invisible to rich people for 20 years. They don't see housekeeping staff any more than they see the wallpaper. That's going to work in our favor now. Caroline felt a spark of hope for the first time since she'd seen Richard's face. She wasn't alone in this. She had an ally, someone who understood what it meant to be overlooked and underestimated. But as she made her way back to her own cabin that night, one thought kept circling through her mind. If Richard was willing to fake his own death and steal another man's identity, what else was he willing to do to protect his secrets? Caroline barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Richard's face, cold, dismissive, dangerous. She'd tossed and turned on her narrow crew bunk until dawn painted gray streaks across her porthole, then given up on sleep altogether and headed to the crew mess hall for coffee that tasted like motor oil. By 8 a.m., she was stationed at her morning post in the Lido Deck Cafe, serving continental breakfast to early rising passengers who wanted to watch the sunrise over the Atlantic. Her hands moved automatically, pouring coffee, refilling pastry trays, wiping down tables, while her mind churned through everything Maggie had told her. Alexander Grant just appeared 13 years ago. No history before March 2011. Paid cash for a presidential suite. Every detail felt like another piece of a puzzle she wasn't sure she wanted to complete. Caroline, Maggie's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. The older woman approached with her housekeeping cart, loaded with fresh linens and cleaning supplies. To anyone watching, it looked like a casual encounter between co-workers. But Caroline caught the meaningful look in Maggie's eyes. Morning activities start in 15 minutes, Maggie said, her voice carefully neutral. Most of the VIP deck passengers will be at the wine tasting in the forward lounge until at least 10:30. Caroline nodded, understanding. Need help with anything today? Actually, yes. Could use an extra pair of hands with the presidential suites. They're always more work than expected. Maggie's smile was perfectly innocent, but her eyes were sharp with purpose. Caroline glanced around the nearly empty cafe. Her supervisor was nowhere to be seen, probably still in the morning staff meeting. I can help for a bit. Let me just clear these tables. 20 minutes later, Caroline found herself following Maggie's cart through the hushed corridors of Deck A. The presidential level was like a different world. Thick carpeting that muffled footsteps, original artwork on the walls, and an air of quiet luxury that made even their whispers seem too loud. Suite A1, Maggie murmured as they stopped before double doors marked with polished brass numbers. Mr. Alexander Grant and guest. Maggie slid her master keycard through the reader, and the lock clicked open with a soft electronic beep. Caroline's heart hammered against her ribs as they stepped inside. The suite was enormous, bigger than some apartments Caroline had lived in. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the ocean, and the morning sun streamed across cream-colored leather furniture and a dining table that could seat 8. Fresh orchids sat in crystal vases, and champagne chilled in a silver bucket near the private balcony. But it was the personal items scattered throughout the space that made Caroline's breath catch in her throat. On the mahogany desk sat a laptop, several manila folders, and a silver picture frame turned face down. Men's clothing hung in the walk-in closet, suits that probably cost more than Caroline's annual salary. A woman's designer dresses occupied the other half of the closet, along with shoes that looked like they belonged in a museum. I'll start in the bedroom, Maggie said quietly. You check the main area. Look for anything that might tell us who this man really is. Caroline nodded and moved toward the desk, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure the entire ship could hear it. She lifted the silver picture frame with trembling fingers and nearly dropped it. The photograph showed Richard, Alexander, whatever he wanted to call himself, standing on what looked like a yacht, his arm around Victoria Whitmore. Both were laughing, looking carefree and deeply in love, but it was the background that made Caroline's blood run cold. She recognized the coastline. It was Martha's Vineyard, where she and Richard had honeymooned 15 years ago, where he'd promised her they'd return someday when they could afford it. He'd returned all right, just not with her. "Caroline," Maggie's voice was urgent but quiet. "Come look at this." Caroline set the frame down and hurried to the bedroom, where Maggie stood beside the walk-in safe. The heavy steel door hung open, revealing stacks of documents and what looked like several passports. "He left it unlocked," Maggie whispered. "Either he's careless or he's planning to leave the ship soon." Caroline peered inside and felt her knees go weak. The passports were fanned out like playing cards. 3 different names, 3 different photographs, but the same green eyes staring back at her. Richard Sullivan, Alexander Grant, and a third identity she'd never seen. Marcus Blackwood. "My God," she breathed. "How many people is he pretending to be?" Maggie pulled out a thick manila folder marked "Insurance Claims, Confidential." Inside were dozens of documents, death certificates, policy payouts, bank transfers. Caroline recognized one name immediately: Richard Sullivan, deceased March 15, 2011. But there were others. Marcus Blackwood, deceased January 2009. Jonathan Davies, deceased August 2010. Each death had resulted in substantial insurance payouts. Each policy beneficiary had been a woman who looked remarkably like Victoria in the accompanying photographs. "He's done this before," Caroline whispered, her voice hollow with shock. "This isn't the first time he's faked his death." Maggie was studying another document. A death certificate for Alexander Grant dated February 28, 2011. "The real Alexander Grant died 2 weeks before your Richard supposedly did. Car accident in Vermont, just like yours was supposed to be." Caroline sank onto the edge of the king-sized bed, her legs no longer able to support her. "He killed him. He killed the real Alexander Grant and took his identity. And he's been living as Alexander ever since," Maggie said grimly. "Look at this." She held up bank statements, showing regular deposits into Alexander Grant's accounts. Millions of dollars over the past 13 years. The money seemed to come from various investment firms and business ventures, all legitimate on the surface. He's not just pretending to be Alexander Grant, Caroline realized. He's built an entire empire using his identity. That's how he got close to Victoria. He needed access to her family fortune to fund this lifestyle. Maggie was photographing documents with her phone, working quickly and efficiently. "We need copies of everything. This is evidence of fraud, identity theft, probably murder." Caroline stood on unsteady legs and moved back to the main room, her mind reeling. She opened the laptop, hoping it wasn't password protected, and was surprised when the screen lit up immediately. Richard had always been careless with technology. His email was open, and Caroline's heart stopped at the subject line of the most recent message: "Obstacles removed. Payment due." The email was from someone identified only as MR and dated 3 days ago. "Grant, the Hayes woman's employment has been confirmed aboard Ocean Majesty. Ship departs tomorrow as scheduled. Wire transfer should be completed within 24 hours of cruise conclusion. Ensure no complications arise during voyage. Cannot have loose ends compromising the Whitmore acquisition." Caroline's hands shook as she scrolled through more emails. There were dozens of them, all cryptic, but clearly outlining some kind of business arrangement. References to cleaning up past mistakes and permanent solutions to temporary problems. One phrase appeared repeatedly: "The daughter must not be allowed to complicate matters." Emily. They were talking about Emily. "Maggie," Caroline called softly, her voice tight with terror. "I think we need to get off this ship now." But before Maggie could respond, they heard the unmistakable sound of a key card being swiped at the suite's entrance. The electronic lock beeped, and the door handle turned. Caroline slammed the laptop shut and dove toward the closet just as voices echoed from the entryway. "I tell you, Victoria, you're being paranoid." Richard's voice, smooth and condescending. "That woman is clearly unbalanced. Probably read about me in some business magazine and concocted this fantasy about knowing me. But Alexander, she seemed so sure. Darling, there are people in this world who prey on others' success. She probably researched my background and found some poor dead man she could claim was her husband. It's a pathetic scam. Caroline pressed herself deeper into the shadows of the walk-in closet, her heart hammering. Through the crack in the door, she could see Maggie frozen in the bedroom doorway, her housekeeping cart positioned to look like she was in the middle of normal cleaning duties. "Oh, housekeeping." Victoria's voice was closer now. "We didn't realize anyone was here. Just finishing up the bedroom, ma'am," Maggie replied smoothly. "I can come back later if you prefer." "No, that's fine. We just need to grab something quickly." Caroline heard Richard's footsteps approaching the desk. Her blood turned to ice as she realized the safe was still open, documents scattered across the bed where Maggie had been photographing them. "Actually," Richard's voice had changed, gone cold and dangerous. "I think we need to have a conversation about what you've been doing in my suite." The last thing Caroline heard before everything went dark was Maggie's sharp intake of breath and the sound of the suite door slamming shut. Caroline held her breath in the suffocating darkness of the closet, her heart pounding so hard she was certain everyone in the suite could hear it. Through the narrow gap in the door, she watched Richard's face transform from mild annoyance to something far more dangerous as he took in the scene. The open safe, the scattered documents, Maggie standing frozen with her cleaning cart like a deer caught in headlights. "Well, well," Richard said softly, his voice carrying that same silky menace Caroline remembered from their confrontation the night before. "It seems we have a very curious housekeeper. I was just cleaning." "Sir?" Maggie replied, her voice steady despite the fear Caroline could see in her posture. "I can come back later if—" "Oh, I don't think so." Richard moved closer to Maggie, and Caroline caught the flash of something metallic in his hand. "You see, I'm very particular about my privacy, and when I find my personal documents spread across my bed like someone's been having a little photography session..." Victoria stepped into Caroline's line of sight, her perfect features creased with confusion. "Alexander, what are you talking about? What documents?" "Nothing for you to worry about, darling. Just some business papers that our friend here seems to have found very interesting." He never took his eyes off Maggie. "The question is, what exactly were you planning to do with those photographs on your phone?" Caroline's stomach lurched. They were trapped, and it was all her fault. She'd dragged Maggie into this nightmare, and now, the suite's main door burst open with a crash that made everyone jump. "Mom, are you in here? The lady at the front desk said you might be..." Emily's voice cut off abruptly as she took in the scene before her. Caroline's world tilted sideways. Her daughter stood in the doorway, backpack slung over one shoulder, her 13-year-old face bright with excitement that was rapidly shifting to confusion. Emily wore her school uniform, the crisp white shirt and navy blazer of the Riverside Academy exchange program. She looked so young, so innocent, so completely unprepared for the monster standing 10 feet away from her. "Emily," Caroline breathed, but the word was lost in the chaos that erupted. Richard had gone absolutely still, his face draining of all color as he stared at the girl in the doorway. His hand, which had been reaching toward Maggie, fell to his side, as if someone had cut the strings holding it up. "Who?" Victoria started to speak, but Richard cut her off with a sharp gesture. "You," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, his eyes locked on Emily's face. "I'm Emily Hayes," Emily said, her natural confidence wavering as she sensed the tension in the room. "I'm looking for my mom, Caroline Hayes. She works in food service, and I just got here with the student exchange program, and they said she might be helping with the suites today." Caroline watched in horror as Richard continued to stare at her daughter, his face cycling through emotions she couldn't read: recognition, shock, something that might have been longing, quickly replaced by something much darker, because Emily looked exactly like him. The same green eyes, the same stubborn chin, the same way of tilting her head slightly when she was confused. 13 years had erased any doubt about paternity that might have existed when she was a baby. Emily was Richard Sullivan's daughter, and everyone in that room could see it. "Oh my God," Victoria whispered, her hand flying to her throat. "Alexander, she looks like no one," Richard said sharply, but his voice cracked on the words. "She's just some kid looking for her mother." Emily's eyebrows drew together in the expression Caroline knew meant she was about to ask uncomfortable questions. "Are you okay, sir? You look like you've seen a ghost." The irony of the statement wasn't lost on anyone. Richard had been dead for 13 years, and now here was the daughter he'd never known, looking at him with curious concern instead of the hatred he deserved. "Emily, honey," Maggie spoke up, her voice carefully calm. "Your mom stepped out for a minute. Maybe you should wait for her down in the cafe." But Emily had inherited more than just her father's looks. She'd gotten his stubborn streak too. Instead of leaving, she stepped further into the suite, her teenage brain clearly trying to process what she was seeing. "This is a really nice room," she said, looking around with the kind of wide-eyed wonder that comes from growing up with very little. "Are you guys like super rich or something?" Victoria made a sound that might have been laughter or hysteria. "Alexander, we need to what?" Richard's voice had regained its coldness, but Caroline could see the way his hands trembled slightly. "Have a conversation with a child who's wandered into the wrong place at the wrong time." "I didn't wander," Emily said, her chin lifting in defiance. "I'm looking for my mom, and I have every right to be here. This is a cruise ship, not a prison." Richard laughed, but there was no humor in it. "A cruise ship, right? Tell me, Emily Hayes, what do you know about your father?" Caroline's blood turned to ice. She pressed her face closer to the crack in the closet door, silently begging her daughter to lie, to make something up, to say anything except the truth. "My dad died when I was a baby," Emily said matter-of-factly. "Car accident. Mom doesn't like to talk about it much. But I know he loved us a lot." "Loved you?" Richard repeated the words like they tasted bitter. "And what would you say if I told you that everything your mother told you about your father was a lie?" "Alexander," Victoria's voice was sharp with warning. "Stop this, she's just a child." But Richard wasn't listening. He was staring at Emily with an intensity that made Caroline want to burst from the closet and put herself between them. "What if I told you that your father didn't die in any car accident? What if I told you he was standing right here in this room?" Emily's face went through several expressions. Confusion, disbelief, a flicker of something that might have been hope before settling into the kind of skeptical look that said she thought she was dealing with a crazy person. "That would be pretty weird, considering you just said you didn't know who I was." Smart girl. Too smart for her own good sometimes. Richard's smile was cold as winter. "Maybe I lied. Maybe I know exactly who you are, Emily Sullivan." Emily's face went pale. No one had called her by that name in years. She'd legally taken Caroline's maiden name when Caroline had changed hers back after the funeral. But the way Richard said it, with such casual cruelty, made it sound like a weapon. "How do you know that name?" Emily whispered. "Because," Richard said, moving closer to her, "I'm the man who gave it to you. I'm Richard Sullivan. I'm your father, and I've been watching you and your mother for a very long time." The words hit the room like a bomb. Victoria gasped and stumbled backward. Maggie grabbed her cleaning cart for support, and Emily just stared at him with those green eyes that were so much like his, her young face processing information that would have broken adults twice her age. "That's impossible," she said finally. "My father is dead. He's been dead for 13 years. Death," Richard said with a smile that never reached his eyes, "is surprisingly easy to fake when you know the right people. The question is, what are we going to do about this little family reunion now that it's happened?" Caroline couldn't stay hidden any longer. Her daughter was in danger, and every maternal instinct she possessed was screaming at her to act. She burst from the closet like a fury unleashed. "Get away from her!" she snarled, putting herself between Richard and Emily. "Don't you dare touch my daughter!" Emily's eyes went wide. "Mom, what are you doing in the closet? And what is he talking about? Is he really—" "He's nothing," Caroline said fiercely, never taking her eyes off Richard. "He's a stranger who's been playing sick games with people's lives, Emily. I need you to leave. Right now." But Richard was laughing again, and the sound was like broken glass. "Oh, Caroline. Always so protective, but I'm afraid it's a bit late for that now, don't you think? The cat's out of the bag, as they say." He looked at Emily with something that might have been paternal pride if it hadn't been so twisted. "She's beautiful, Caroline. I have to admit, you did a good job raising her, even if you did fill her head with lies about her dear old dad. You're not her father," Caroline said through gritted teeth. "A father doesn't abandon his family. A father doesn't fake his own death and leave his wife and child to struggle alone. A father," Richard countered smoothly, does whatever is necessary to secure his family's future, even if they're too simple to understand it at the time. Emily looked between them, her face cycling through emotions too complex for someone so young. "Is it true?" she whispered. "Are you really my father?" Richard smiled, and for just a moment, Caroline saw a flicker of the man she'd once loved. "Hello, Emily. I know this is a lot to take in, but yes, I'm your father, and despite what your mother thinks, I never stopped caring about you." "Then why?" Emily's voice cracked. "Why did you leave us?" And just like that, the moment of tenderness was gone, replaced by the cold calculation Caroline had seen the night before. "Because," Richard said simply, "sometimes you have to sacrifice the present for the future, and now that we're all here together, we need to discuss what that future is going to look like." The silence that followed Richard's words was deafening. Caroline could hear her own heartbeat, the distant hum of the ship's engines, and Emily's shallow breathing as her daughter tried to process the impossible truth that had just shattered her world. Victoria was the first to break the spell. She stepped forward, her perfectly manicured hands trembling as she pointed an accusatory finger at Richard. "Alexander, or Richard, or whatever your real name is, what the hell is going on here?" Her cultured voice cracked with strain. "You have a daughter, a wife, and you never thought to mention this." Richard's expression shifted to one of practiced calm, the mask he'd worn for 13 years sliding back into place. "Victoria, darling, you're overreacting. This is ancient history." "Ancient history?" Victoria's voice pitched higher, hysteria creeping in around the edges. "Your supposedly dead wife is standing right here with your child, and you call it ancient history." Caroline watched the exchange with growing hope. If Victoria turned against Richard, if she could make the other woman see what kind of monster she was engaged to. "He's been lying to you," Caroline said, her voice steady despite the chaos swirling around her. "About everything. His name, his past, probably his feelings for you too." Victoria whirled on her, eyes blazing. "And why should I believe you? Some desperate woman who's clearly obsessed with my fiancé. Because I can prove it." Caroline's words rang with conviction she didn't entirely feel. "Maggie found documents in his safe, passports with different names, insurance fraud, death certificates." "That's enough." Richard's voice cut through the air like a blade. He moved toward Maggie's cleaning cart, where her phone lay forgotten among the cleaning supplies. "I think our housekeeper has been very busy with her little photography session." Maggie stepped protectively in front of her cart, but Richard was faster. He snatched the phone and scrolled through the photos she'd taken, his face growing darker with each swipe. "Very thorough," he murmured. "Bank statements, insurance documents, death certificates. You've been quite the little detective, haven't you? Those photos prove what he is," Caroline said desperately, turning to Victoria. "He's not Alexander Grant. Alexander Grant died 13 years ago, and Richard stole his identity, just like he's stolen others." Victoria's face had gone pale, but her jaw was set in stubborn denial. "This is ridiculous. Alexander has been nothing but honest with me. We've been together for 3 years. 3 years, Caroline interrupted. How long has he been asking you to marry him? How long has he been getting you to trust him with your finances?" The question hit its mark. Victoria's eyes flickered with uncertainty. "He's never asked for money. He has his own fortune, built on stolen identities and insurance fraud," Maggie spoke up, her voice quiet but firm. "I saw the documents, ma'am. Your fiancé has been living as a dead man for over a decade." Emily, who had been unnaturally quiet during this exchange, suddenly stepped forward. Her young face was set in an expression Caroline recognized. The same stubborn determination that had gotten her through 13 years of believing her father was a hero instead of the villain standing before her. "You said you never stopped caring about us," Emily said, her voice small but unwavering. "But you let Mom work 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. You let her cry herself to sleep every night for years. You let me grow up thinking my dad was dead." Richard's face softened for just a moment, and Caroline saw a flicker of something that might have been genuine remorse, but it was gone so quickly she wondered if she'd imagined it. "Emily," he said, his voice almost gentle, "you don't understand. Sometimes adults have to make difficult choices. You chose to abandon us." Emily cut him off. and Caroline had never been prouder of her daughter's courage. You chose to let us suffer while you played dress-up with stolen names and other people's money. That's not a difficult choice. That's just selfish. Victoria was watching this exchange with growing horror, and Caroline could see the exact moment when doubt crept into her eyes. The way Richard had spoken to Emily, the casual cruelty mixed with that brief flash of paternal instinct. It painted a picture of a man capable of anything. The emails, Victoria whispered suddenly. The business trips you never wanted to talk about, the way you always paid for everything in cash. I thought you were just private, but nothing, Richard said sharply. But Caroline could see he was losing control of the situation. Victoria, you're letting these people poison your mind against me. Can't you see what they're trying to do? What I can see, Victoria said slowly, her voice gaining strength, is that the man I thought I knew doesn't exist, Alexander. If that's even your real name. Who else have you been lying to? What else haven't you told me? Richard's composure finally cracked. You want the truth? Fine. Yes. I took Alexander Grant's identity after he died. Yes. I faked my death to escape my old life. But everything I did for us. For our future together. You did it for yourself, Caroline said fiercely. You left your wife and baby daughter to fend for themselves, while you built a new life with stolen money and a stolen name. Don't you dare try to make that sound noble. I was in debt to dangerous people, Richard exploded, his careful mask finally slipping completely. Do you think I had a choice? They would have killed all of us if I hadn't disappeared. So instead, you killed yourself and left us to deal with the consequences. Caroline shot back. Do you have any idea what it was like? Richard, any idea at all? My name is Alexander Grant. Your name is Richard Sullivan, and you're a coward and a fraud. Emily moved closer to Caroline, instinctively seeking protection from the anger crackling between her parents. Victoria backed toward the door, her face a mask of shock and revulsion. I need air, Victoria whispered. I need to think. This is all, it's too much. Victoria, wait. Richard started toward her, but she held up a hand to stop him. Don't come near me right now. She looked around the room, taking in the scattered documents, the evidence of the life Richard had hidden from her. How many other women have there been? How many other identities? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Richard's silence was answer enough. I'm calling security, Victoria said, her voice stronger now. And the police. When we dock, the authorities are going to want to hear about all of this. I don't think so. Richard's voice had gone cold and dangerous again. He still held Maggie's phone, and Caroline noticed he'd moved to block the suite's exit. I'm afraid no one is leaving until we work out a more permanent solution to this problem. Caroline felt ice forming in her veins. She pulled Emily closer, meeting Maggie's eyes across the room. The older woman gave an almost imperceptible nod. She understood the danger they were all in. Victoria laughed, but there was no humor in it. Are you threatening us? Your own daughter. I'm protecting my future, Richard said simply. Emily's existence complicates things with your family's lawyers. Caroline's testimony could destroy everything I've built. And now you know enough to ruin me. So what are you suggesting? Victoria asked, though Caroline could see in her face that she already knew the answer. I'm suggesting, Richard said with that same cold smile, that accidents happen all the time on cruise ships. People fall overboard. They disappear without a trace, and the ocean never gives up its secrets. Emily gasped, and Caroline felt her daughter's small body trembling against her side. But Victoria surprised everyone by laughing again, this time with genuine amusement. You really think you can threaten me and get away with it? She asked. Do you have any idea who my family is? What kind of resources we have? I know you're worth more dead than alive, Richard replied matter-of-factly. At least to me. Your family's fortune comes to me when we marry. And all of it comes to me if you die tragically on our honeymoon cruise. The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. She staggered backward, her face draining of color as the full scope of Richard's betrayal became clear. You were going to kill me, she whispered. After the wedding, you were planning to murder me too. Planning is such an ugly word, Richard said with that terrifying smile. I prefer to think of it as insurance. And that's when Victoria Whitmore, socialite and heiress, proved she had more steel in her spine than anyone had given her credit for. "Well then," she said, her voice deadly calm, "I guess we'll just have to make sure that doesn't happen, won't we?" The transformation in Victoria Whitmore was remarkable to witness. Gone was the pampered socialite who had entered the suite an hour ago. Replaced by someone whose steel spine and razor-sharp intelligence had been hidden beneath designer clothes and perfect manners, she moved away from the door with predatory grace, her eyes never leaving Richard's face. "You know what I find fascinating," Victoria said conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather rather than murder plots. 3 years of pillow talk, and you never once slipped up. Not once did you mention Caroline or Emily or any of your previous lives. That takes a special kind of sociopath. Richard's jaw tightened. "Victoria, you're being dramatic." "Am I?" She gestured toward the scattered documents on the bed. "Let's talk about Marcus Blackwood, shall we? The identity you used before you became Alexander Grant? I'm betting there's a wife and maybe some children missing him too." Caroline felt Emily stiffen beside her. The idea that there might be other families, other victims of Richard's calculated cruelty, was almost too much to bear. "There were no children with Marcus," Richard said, and the casual way he admitted to another stolen identity made Caroline's stomach turn. Lisa Blackwood was, unfortunately, barren. It made the transition easier. "The transition?" Victoria repeated flatly. "You mean when you murdered her husband and took his place?" "I never killed anyone directly," Richard protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Marcus died in a skiing accident. I simply took advantage of the opportunity." Maggie snorted from her position near the cleaning cart. "Right, just like the real Alexander Grant died in that convenient car accident 2 weeks before you needed a new identity." "The timing was fortunate," Richard admitted with a shrug that made Caroline want to slap him. "Alexander was perfect. No close family, substantial assets, the right age and build. It took months of careful planning to assume his life completely." "Months," Caroline whispered, the pieces clicking together with horrible clarity. "You were planning your death for months before it happened. While you were lying next to me every night, kissing me goodbye every morning, you were planning to abandon Emily and me." Richard turned to her with that same cold smile she was beginning to hate more than anything in the world. "I was planning to give you a clean break from a life that was about to become very complicated. You should be grateful." "Grateful?" Caroline's voice cracked with rage. "For what? For letting me believe I was a widow. For watching me work myself to the bone trying to provide for our daughter. For letting Emily grow up without a father. For keeping you safe," Richard snapped. "Do you think Viktor Kozlov and his associates would have stopped looking for me just because I was married? Do you think they would have hesitated to use you and Emily as leverage? I disappeared so they couldn't find me, which meant they couldn't find you either." Emily spoke up, her young voice cutting through the tension. "Who's Viktor Kozlov?" The question hung in the air like a death sentence. Richard's face went pale, and Caroline realized that in his anger, he'd revealed more than he intended. Victoria was the first to understand. "Russian mafia," she said quietly. "Oh my God, Alexander, Richard, what did you do?" "Nothing I couldn't handle," Richard said, but his confidence was cracking. "It was just business. Victor loaned me money for some investments that didn't pan out. When he came to collect, I needed time to gather the funds." "How much?" Caroline asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. $2.7 million, Richard said matter-of-factly, plus interest, plus penalties for late payment. It had grown to nearly $4 million by the time I disappeared. The number hit Caroline like a physical blow. $4 million. She'd struggled to pay rent on a one-bedroom apartment while he owed $4 million to the Russian mob. "So you faked your death rather than face your debts," Victoria said with disgust, "and left your wife and child to deal with the consequences if anyone came looking." "No one came looking," Richard protested. "Victor believed I was dead. The plan worked perfectly. Until now," Maggie said quietly. "What happens when they find out Richard Sullivan is alive and well, and living as Alexander Grant with access to the Whitmore fortune?" The color drained from Richard's face. "They won't find out." "They might," Victoria said with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "Especially if someone were to tip them off about where to find you." "You wouldn't." But Richard's voice was uncertain now. "Wouldn't I? You were planning to murder me for my inheritance. I think that makes us even." Caroline watched this exchange with growing hope and terror. If Viktor Kozlov was as dangerous as Richard seemed to think, involving the Russian mob could put all of them in danger. But Victoria's threat had clearly rattled Richard in a way nothing else had. "There's more," Maggie said suddenly. She'd been quietly going through the documents while the others argued, and now she held up a thick folder marked contingency plans. "Look at this." She opened the folder to reveal what looked like detailed dossiers on several women, including Victoria. Each file contained photographs, financial records, family histories, and what appeared to be psychological profiles. "You've been doing this for years," Victoria breathed, staring at her own file. "Shopping for wealthy women like we're catalog items." "Due diligence," Richard said coldly. "I needed to understand what I was getting into." Caroline grabbed one of the other files and felt her heart stop. The photograph showed a beautiful blonde woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. The name at the top read, Jennifer Chen, net worth, $8.2 million, status, deceased. "Jennifer Chen died in a boating accident 6 months after you started dating her," Caroline read aloud. "Accidental drowning in Lake Tahoe." She looked up at Richard with horror. "You killed her." "Jennifer's death was tragic but convenient," Richard said with chilling casualness. "She'd started asking uncomfortable questions about my past. Sometimes problems solve themselves." Emily made a small sound of distress, and Caroline pulled her daughter closer. The monster standing before them wasn't just a fraud and a thief. He was a serial killer who had been hunting wealthy women for over a decade. "How many?" Victoria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "How many women have you killed?" Richard considered the question with the detachment of someone discussing the weather. "Directly, only 2. Jennifer and Lisa Blackwood. The others died in accidents that I may have. Facilitated car crashes, mostly. Very difficult to prove they weren't genuine accidents." The casual admission of multiple murders sent a chill through the room. Even Emily, who had been trying so hard to find something redeemable in the father she'd never known, pressed closer to Caroline with fear in her eyes. "You're insane," Victoria whispered. "I'm practical," Richard corrected. "I identify opportunities and I exploit them. You represented a significant opportunity, Victoria. Your trust fund, your family's real estate holdings, your father's art collection. Marrying you would have set me up for life, and killing me would have given you access to all of it without the inconvenience of a wife." "Precisely." The word hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Victoria stared at the man she'd thought she loved, her face cycling through emotions too complex to name. Betrayal, horror, disgust, and underneath it all, a growing fury that made her green eyes burn like emeralds. "Well," she said finally, her voice deadly calm, "I suppose that's where your plan falls apart." "Does it?" Richard asked. And Caroline didn't like the confidence creeping back into his voice. "You're all here, in my suite, with evidence that could destroy multiple lives. Emily's testimony could expose everything. Caroline's very existence threatens my new identity. And you, my dear Victoria, know far too much to be allowed to leave this ship alive. You're talking about murdering 4 people," Caroline said, her voice steady despite her fear. "On a ship full of witnesses. You can't possibly think you'll get away with that." Richard smiled that cold, terrible smile. "Accidents happen on cruise ships all the time. People drink too much and fall overboard. Tragic, but not uncommon. And by the time anyone realizes you're missing, we'll be in international waters where these things become much more manageable." "You forgot one thing," Victoria said quietly. "What's that?" Victoria pulled out her phone, and Caroline's heart leaped as she realized what the other woman had been doing during Richard's confession. "I've been recording everything," Victoria said with satisfaction. "Every word, every admission, and I sent it all to my lawyers, my family, and the FBI field office in Miami about 10 minutes ago." Richard's face went white, then red, then a mottled purple that suggested he was about to have a stroke. "You did what?" "I protected myself," Victoria said simply. "Something I should have done 3 years ago when you first started love-bombing me. But I was lonely and stupid, and you were very, very good at playing the perfect man." Richard lunged toward her, but Victoria was ready. She stepped aside with dancer-like grace and brought her phone down hard on his wrist. He howled and stumbled, giving Caroline and Emily the opening they needed to move toward the door. But Maggie was already there, her master key card ready. "Time to go," she said grimly. "Security's been alerted they're on their way up," as if summoned by her words. The sound of running footsteps echoed in the corridor outside, followed by urgent radio chatter. Richard straightened, his face a mask of rage and desperation. "This isn't over. None of you understand what you've done. Viktor Kozlov doesn't forgive or forget. And when he finds out I'm alive, he'll kill you," Victoria finished. "Good. Save the taxpayers the cost of a trial." The suite door burst open, and Caroline had never been happier to see security uniforms in her life. The next 6 hours passed in a blur of interviews, statements, and emergency meetings in the ship's security office. Captain Miguel Santos, a weathered man in his 60s with kind eyes and an iron backbone, had taken personal charge of the situation the moment his security team reported the discovery of multiple forged identities and confession recordings. Caroline sat in a small conference room adjacent to the captain's quarters, Emily curled up asleep against her shoulder. Despite the uncomfortable plastic chairs, her daughter had been remarkably strong throughout the initial interviews, answering questions with a maturity that broke Caroline's heart. No 13-year-old should have to learn that her father was a serial killer. But Emily had handled it with a resilience that made Caroline proud and heartbroken in equal measure. "How is she holding up?" Maggie asked quietly, settling into the chair across from them with 2 cups of coffee that smelled like heaven after the longest day of Caroline's life. "Better than I am, probably," Caroline admitted, accepting the coffee gratefully. "She keeps asking if we're safe now, and I honestly don't know what to tell her." Through the conference room's small window, Caroline could see the Ocean Majesty's security team escorting Richard. She refused to think of him as Alexander anymore, to what the captain had described as secure quarters in the ship's lower levels. Even from this distance, she could see the rage in his posture, the way he fought against the restraints with the fury of a trapped animal. "The FBI will be waiting when we dock in Miami tomorrow," Maggie said, following Caroline's gaze. "Captain Santos has been in contact with them since Victoria sent those recordings. They're treating this as a multi-state investigation now." Caroline nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it wouldn't be that simple. Richard had spent 13 years building elaborate false identities and staying one step ahead of both the law and the Russian mob. She doubted he'd go quietly to a federal prison cell. The conference room door opened, and Victoria entered, looking like she'd aged 10 years in the past few hours. Her perfect hair was disheveled, her designer dress wrinkled, and there were dark circles under her eyes that even the best concealer couldn't hide. But there was something else there too, a steel-backed determination that hadn't been there when Caroline first met her. "Any news from the captain?" Victoria asked, settling into a chair with the careful movements of someone who'd discovered that the ground beneath their feet wasn't as solid as they'd believed. "They've been in contact with the FBI and Interpol," Maggie replied. "Apparently your Richard has been on several watch lists for years. They just never connected all his identities. He's not my Richard," Victoria said sharply, then immediately looked apologetic. "I'm sorry. I know he was your husband first. I can't believe I lived with that monster for 3 years and never saw it." Caroline studied the other woman's face, seeing genuine pain and self-recrimination there. He was very good at hiding what he was. "I lived with him for 5 years and never suspected he was capable of any of this. The debt to the Russian mob," Victoria said quietly. "Did you know about that?" "Not a clue. Richard always handled our finances. Said it was too complicated for me to worry about." Caroline laughed bitterly. "I was such an idiot. I trusted him completely." "We both did," Victoria said. "That's what predators like him count on. Trust, love, the assumption that the people closest to us would never hurt us." Emily stirred against Caroline's shoulder, blinking sleepy eyes as she tried to orient herself. "Are we still on the ship? I had the weirdest dream that Dad was alive and trying to kill people." The silence that followed was deafening. Emily's face went through several emotions as reality crashed back over her. Confusion, hope, and finally, resigned acceptance. "It wasn't a dream, was it?" Emily asked quietly. "No, sweetheart. I'm afraid it wasn't." Emily was quiet for a long moment, processing this with the careful concentration of someone much older than 13. "Is he really my father biologically, I mean?" Caroline felt her heart break a little more. Yes, he is. But he left us. He did. And he killed other people. Yes. Emily nodded slowly as if confirming something to herself. Then I don't want him to be my father anymore. Can we make that legal somehow? Caroline blinked back tears, not sure if they were from pride or heartbreak. We can certainly try. Victoria leaned forward in her chair. Emily, I know this is incredibly difficult, but I need to ask you something. Has anyone ever tried to contact you about your father? Phone calls, emails, strangers asking questions. Emily frowned, thinking, not really, although... She paused, her expression growing troubled. There was this man at my school last month. He said he was writing an article about single mothers and wanted to interview Mom. He kept asking questions about when Dad died and whether we had any keepsakes from him. Caroline's blood turned to ice. You never told me about this. I told him Mom was too busy working to talk to reporters. He gave me his card and said to have you call him. But I threw it away because you hate talking to strangers about Dad. Maggie and Victoria exchanged alarmed looks. Emily, Maggie said gently, do you remember what this man looked like? Short, kind of heavy, with glasses. He had a weird accent. Maybe Russian? Caroline felt the conference room spinning around her. Viktor Kozlov's people. They've been watching Emily. We need to tell the captain immediately, Victoria said, already reaching for her phone. But before anyone could move, the lights in the conference room flickered and died. Emergency lighting kicked in a second later, bathing everything in an eerie red glow. What the hell? Maggie started to say, but her words were cut off by the ship's intercom crackling to life. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are experiencing a temporary power outage in several sections of the ship. All passengers are advised to remain calm and stay in your current locations until further notice. Security teams are investigating the situation. But Caroline could hear something in Captain Santos's voice that suggested this wasn't a routine technical problem. There was tension there, barely controlled worry that made her stomach clench with fear. Mom, Emily whispered, pressing closer to Caroline's side. I'm scared. Before Caroline could respond, the conference room door burst open, but instead of security officers or the captain, 3 men in dark clothing entered, their faces hidden behind ski masks. The leader carried what looked like a military-grade radio, and when he spoke, his accent was thick and unmistakably Russian. Ladies, please remain calm. We are here to collect something that belongs to our employer, and if you cooperate, no one will be hurt. Caroline's heart stopped. Viktor Kozlov's men had found them. There's been a mistake, Victoria said with admirable calm, though Caroline could see her hands shaking. We don't have anything that belongs to you. The man laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth. Oh, but you do. You have Richard Sullivan, who has been dead for 13 years but seems to have made remarkable recovery. Mr. Kozlov would very much like to speak with him about old debts. He's in custody, Maggie said. Ship's security has him locked up. Not anymore, the man replied pleasantly. My associates have already retrieved Mr. Sullivan from his temporary accommodations, but Mr. Kozlov also has some questions for the people who helped expose his location. Caroline felt Emily trembling against her side and wrapped her arms more tightly around her daughter. Please, she said, hating the pleading note in her voice but unable to suppress it. My daughter has nothing to do with this. She's just a child. Mr. Sullivan's child, the man corrected, which makes her very valuable indeed, you see. Mr. Kozlov believes in comprehensive collections. He wants not only his money, but also assurance that Mr. Sullivan's family will not cause future complications. What does that mean? Emily asked, her voice small but steady. The man's smile was visible even through the ski mask. It means, little one, that you and your mother are coming with us, along with the lady who helped expose Mr. Sullivan's activities. Mr. Kozlov has questions for all of you. Victoria stood suddenly, her chair scraping against the floor. You can't just kidnap passengers off a cruise ship. The Coast Guard, the FBI, are several hours away, the man finished. Mr. Kozlov has been planning this reunion for some time. Your ship's power grid is more vulnerable than you might think, and there are many places in international waters where helicopters can land without being detected. As if summoned by his words, the distant thrum of rotor blades became audible over the ship's emergency systems. Caroline looked at Emily, at Maggie, at Victoria, and saw the same realization in all their eyes. They'd escaped Richard's immediate threat, only to fall into something far more dangerous. "Move," the man commanded, gesturing toward the door with his radio. "Mr. Kozlov does not like to be kept waiting." As they were herded from the conference room into the eerily lit corridors of the powerless ship, Caroline caught sight of something that made her heart race with desperate hope. Through a porthole, she could see lights on the horizon. Another ship, maybe military, heading in their direction. But would help arrive in time? Or would they disappear into the night like so many of Richard's other victims? The helicopter's roar grew louder, and Caroline pulled Emily closer, whispering a prayer to whatever gods might be listening to ships lost at sea. The helicopter's rotor wash whipped Caroline's hair across her face as they were forced up the ship's emergency stairs toward the upper deck. The Ocean Majesty's emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red shadows, and the lack of main power had left most of the ship in darkness, save for the scattered glow of backup systems. Emily stumbled on the steep stairs, and Caroline caught her daughter's arm, pulling her close. "Stay with me, sweetheart," she whispered. "Whatever happens, stay right beside me." Behind them, one of Kozlov's men prodded Victoria forward with the barrel of his weapon. Maggie brought up the rear, her weathered face set in grim determination despite the impossible circumstances they faced. "Where are you taking us?" Victoria demanded, her voice carrying more authority than Caroline would have expected from someone being kidnapped at gunpoint. "To a family reunion," the lead gunman replied with dark amusement. "Mr. Kozlov has been very patient, waiting to see Mr. Sullivan again. 13 years is a long time to carry a debt." They emerged onto Deck 10, the ship's highest passenger level, where the wind from the helicopter's rotors was so strong Caroline had to shield Emily with her body. The aircraft hovered 30 feet above them, a matte black military-style helicopter with no visible markings. A rope ladder dropped from its belly, swaying dangerously in the rotor wash, but it was the scene waiting for them on the deck that made Caroline's blood run cold. Richard stood near the ship's railing, his hands zip-tied behind his back, blood trickling from a cut above his left eye. 2 more masked men flanked him, automatic weapons trained on his chest. But it was the man standing directly in front of Richard that commanded attention. Victor Kozlov was not what Caroline had expected. She'd imagined someone large and brutish, a stereotype from Hollywood movies. Instead, he was small and neat, probably in his early 60s, wearing an expensive suit that looked absurdly formal given the circumstances. His gray hair was perfectly styled despite the helicopter wind, and his pale blue eyes held the kind of cold intelligence that made Caroline understand why Richard had been so terrified of him. "Ah, Richard," Kozlov said in accented English, his voice somehow audible over the helicopter noise. "Or should I call you Alexander? I must admit, I was impressed when I learned about your elaborate masquerade. Very creative, very expensive to maintain." Richard's face was a mask of defiant terror. "Victor, listen, I can explain." "Explain?" Kozlov's eyebrows rose in polite surprise. "What is there to explain? You borrowed money from me. You failed to repay it. You faked your death to avoid your obligations. Then you stole another man's identity and built a fortune that rightfully belongs to me." He smiled, and the expression was more terrifying than any scream of rage could have been. "I think I understand the situation perfectly." Caroline found herself pushed forward until she stood just a few feet from the man who had haunted Richard's nightmares for 13 years. Up close, she could see the calculation behind Kozlov's mild exterior, the way he assessed each person like pieces on a chessboard. "And you must be the widow," Kozlov continued, turning his attention to Caroline with that same pleasant smile. "Mrs. Caroline Sullivan, who worked so hard to support her daughter after her husband's tragic death. Tell me, did you know about Richard's debts to me?" "No," Caroline managed, her voice barely carrying over the wind. "I didn't know about any of it." "Innocent," Kozlov mused. "How refreshing, Richard. You never told your wife about the risks you were taking with her future." "She didn't need to know," Richard said through gritted teeth. "It was my problem to solve." "Your problem," Kozlov repeated thoughtfully. "But she lived with the consequences, didn't she? Poverty, struggle, working multiple jobs to feed your child, while you lived in luxury with other women's money." The way he said it, almost sympathetically, made Caroline's skin crawl. This man might be a monster, but he understood exactly what Richard had done to her in a way that felt uncomfortably perceptive. And this beautiful young lady must be Emily, Kozlov continued, his attention shifting to Caroline's daughter. 13 years old, yes, born just months before your father's. Resurrection. Emily lifted her chin with a courage that made Caroline's heart swell with pride and terror. He's not my father anymore. A real father doesn't abandon his family. Kozlov's smile widened, and for a moment, it almost seemed genuine. Wise words from such a young person. You are quite right. A man who abandons his family is no father at all. Victor, Richard interrupted desperately. The women don't matter. You want your money? Fine, I can get it. The Whitmore fortune is worth hundreds of millions, more than enough to cover what I owe you with interest. Victoria stepped forward, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. The hell it is. You'll never touch another penny of my family's money. Kozlov turned his attention to her with obvious interest. Miss Victoria Whitmore, I presume, the latest in Richard's collection of wealthy women. Tell me, did you love him? The question seemed to catch Victoria off guard. She glanced at Richard, then back at Kozlov, her face cycling through emotions Caroline couldn't read. I thought I did, Victoria said finally. But I loved a lie. The man I thought I knew never existed. Love built on deception is not love at all, Kozlov observed. It is merely successful fraud. Richard has always been talented at creating illusions. Look, Richard said, his desperation making his voice crack. We can work this out. Business is business, Victor. I have access to resources now that I never had 13 years ago. We can make a deal. Kozlov was quiet for a long moment, considering. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, silver pistol that looked almost delicate in his hands. You are correct that business is business, he said calmly. But you seem to misunderstand what business we are conducting tonight. Caroline felt Emily press closer to her side and wrapped her arms around her daughter, trying to shield her from whatever was about to happen. Maggie moved protectively closer to both of them, while Victoria stood frozen, her face pale in the emergency lighting. This was never about the money, Kozlov continued, his voice conversational despite the weapon in his hand. $4 million is a rounding error in my organization's annual budget. This is about respect, about consequences, about ensuring that when Victor Kozlov extends credit, it is repaid, or the debtor faces appropriate penalties. Victor, please, Richard started, but Kozlov held up a hand to silence him. You stole 13 years from me, Richard. 13 years of believing you were dead, of writing off a debt that should have been paid in blood. Do you understand how that made me look to my associates, to my competitors? The helicopter's engine changed pitch, and Caroline realized they were preparing to land on the ship's deck. More men would be coming down, making any chance of escape even more impossible. But I am not an unreasonable man, Kozlov continued. I believe in proportional responses. You took 13 years from me, so I will take something of equivalent value from you. Caroline's stomach clenched as she realized what he meant. Please, she said, stepping forward despite every instinct telling her to run. Whatever he owes you, whatever he's done, Emily is innocent. She's just a child. Kozlov's pale eyes studied Caroline with something that might have been respect. You would die for your daughter, without hesitation. And you, he said, turning to Victoria, would you die for the man who planned to murder you? No, Victoria said without hesitation. But I'd die to stop him from hurting that child. Interesting. Kozlov seemed genuinely pleased by this answer. And you, Miss Lee, the housekeeper who discovered Richard's secrets. Maggie straightened to her full height, meeting the Russian's gaze without flinching. I've lived 58 years watching rich people treat others like garbage. If I'm going to die tonight, at least it'll be trying to protect decent people from a monster. Kozlov nodded approvingly, then turned back to Richard. Do you hear that? Richard, these women, whom you have lied to, betrayed, and endangered, are all willing to die to protect your daughter, your own daughter, whom you abandoned without a second thought. Richard's face was a mask of rage and desperation. They don't understand what they're talking about. This is between you and me, Victor. No, Kozlov said softly. This is about what kind of man you really are, and I think it's time everyone saw your true face. He raised the pistol, but instead of pointing it at Richard, he aimed it at Emily. Caroline screamed and threw herself in front of her daughter just as Richard broke. "No!" he shouted, lunging forward despite his restraints. "Don't touch her. She's my daughter." The admission hung in the air like a gunshot. For the first time since she'd seen him alive, Caroline heard something genuine in Richard's voice. Terror, love, desperation. The mask of cold calculation had finally slipped, revealing the frightened man beneath. Kozlov lowered the gun, his smile returning. There he is, the real Richard Sullivan. It only took threatening his child to find him. Richard was shaking now, his composure completely shattered. "Please, Victor, kill me if you want. But leave them alone. They've suffered enough because of me. Now we're getting somewhere," Kozlov said with satisfaction. "Finally, some honesty, some acknowledgement of what your choices have cost others." The helicopter settled onto the deck with a final roar of engines, and Caroline realized that whatever Kozlov had planned, it was about to begin in earnest. But in Richard's broken plea, she'd heard something she thought was lost forever. The voice of the man she'd once loved, buried beneath 13 years of lies and selfishness. The question was whether finding it again would be enough to save any of them. The helicopter's rotors slowed to an idle as more of Kozlov's men emerged from the aircraft, their boots hitting the deck with military precision. Caroline counted 6 additional armed figures, all moving with the coordinated efficiency of professionals. The Ocean Majesty was now completely under their control. Kozlov studied the assembled group with the satisfaction of a chess master contemplating checkmate. "Richard, I want you to understand something very clearly. Your debt to me has grown beyond money. It has become a matter of principle. What do you want?" Richard asked, his voice hoarse with desperation. "I want you to choose," Kozlov replied simply. "You spent 13 years running from the consequences of your actions tonight. You face them, but I am not without mercy. I will allow you to decide how this ends." Caroline felt Emily trembling against her side and tightened her protective embrace. Around them, the ship's emergency lighting cast everything in hellish shadows, while the distant sound of the approaching Coast Guard vessels grew steadily louder. "Choose what?" Victoria demanded, stepping closer despite the obvious danger. Kozlov's pale eyes gleamed with anticipation. "Richard can come with me willingly, face justice for his crimes, and spend the rest of his life working to repay his debts, or..." The pause stretched like a death sentence. "Or," Caroline whispered, "or his family pays the price for his cowardice," Kozlov finished. "One life to balance the scales of justice. Richard dies here tonight, and you all go free. The choice is his." Richard's face went white. "You can't be serious." "I am always serious about business, Richard, you know this." Kozlov gestured to his men, who immediately raised their weapons. "You have 60 seconds to decide. Your life or your daughter's future, and the future of these women who have shown more courage tonight than you have in 13 years. Caroline's mind raced frantically. She could hear the Coast Guard vessels getting closer, their searchlights beginning to sweep the dark water around the ship. But would they arrive in time? And even if they did, could they stop what was happening here? 30 seconds, Kozlov announced calmly. "Wait," Emily said suddenly, her young voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Everyone turned to stare at her as she stepped forward, pulling away from Caroline's protective embrace. "I want to say something." "Emily." "No," Caroline started, but her daughter held up a hand with surprising authority. "You," Emily said, looking directly at Richard, "are not my father. A father protects his family. A father doesn't abandon them or put them in danger. You've done nothing but cause pain for everyone who ever loved you." Richard's face crumpled. "Emily, I'm not finished," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "You want to know what I choose? I choose not to let you destroy any more lives. I choose to be better than you, and I choose to forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because carrying hate for someone who's already dead inside is just poisoning myself." The words hit Richard like physical blows. Caroline watched in amazement as her 13-year-old daughter faced down both her biological father and the Russian mobster with a dignity that left everyone speechless. "But here's what I won't choose," Emily continued, turning to face Kozlov. "I won't choose to let fear control my life the way it controlled his. You want to kill someone. Kill me, but stop pretending this is about justice or business or any of that garbage. This is about power and cruelty, and I won't be part of it." Kozlov stared at Emily for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, incredibly, he began to laugh. Not the cold, calculating sound they'd heard before, but something that seemed almost genuine. "Remarkable," he said, shaking his head. "Absolutely remarkable, Richard. Do you understand what you threw away? This child has more courage in her little finger than you have in your entire body." "I know," Richard whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I know what I lost, what I threw away, what I destroyed." 10 seconds, Kozlov announced, but his tone had changed somehow. That's when Caroline heard it, the distinctive whoop, whoop, whoop of multiple helicopters approaching fast. Not just the Coast Guard, but something heavier, more military. Through the darkness, she could see lights converging on their position from multiple directions. Kozlov heard it too. His mild expression hardened into something far more dangerous. "It seems we have company," one of his men spoke rapidly in Russian. Gesturing toward the approaching aircraft, Kozlov nodded and turned back to Richard with deadly calm. "Time's up, Richard. Choose now." "I choose..." Richard started to speak, but he never got the chance to finish. The deck erupted in blinding white light as military helicopters surrounded the Ocean Majesty, their searchlights turning night into day. Loudspeakers crackled to life, voices in English and Russian demanding immediate surrender. In the chaos that followed, Caroline lost track of everything except keeping Emily safe. She threw herself over her daughter as Kozlov's men spun toward the new threat. Weapons raised, Victoria dove for cover behind a ventilation unit, while Maggie pressed herself against the deck railing. But Richard, his hands still zip-tied behind his back, did something that shocked everyone. He charged directly at Kozlov. "Run!" he screamed at Caroline and Emily. "Get out of here!" Kozlov spun toward him, raising his pistol, but Richard's desperate tackle sent both men crashing into the ship's railing. The gun fired wildly into the air as they struggled, Richard trying to use his body weight to pin the smaller man despite his bound hands. "Emily, move!" Caroline shouted, grabbing her daughter and pulling her toward the stairwell as gunfire erupted around them. Military snipers were picking off Kozlov's men with surgical precision, but the deck had become a war zone. Victoria appeared beside them, blood streaming from a cut on her forehead. "This way! Maggie found another exit!" They ran toward where Maggie was waving frantically from a maintenance hatch, bullets whining over their heads. Behind them, Caroline could hear Richard and Kozlov still fighting, their struggle punctuated by shouts in English and Russian. "In here!" Maggie shouted, pulling the hatch open. "It leads to the interior stairs." Caroline pushed Emily through first, then followed with Victoria close behind. As Maggie started to climb through, a gunshot echoed from the deck above, different from the others. Closer, more final, then silence. They huddled in the narrow maintenance shaft, listening to the sounds of the battle winding down above. Military voices shouted orders, followed by the distinctive sound of zip ties being applied and suspects being read their rights. "Is it over?" Emily whispered. Before anyone could answer, they heard footsteps on the deck above, then Captain Santos's voice over the ship's intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. The situation has been resolved. All passengers are safe. Emergency power is being restored." Caroline felt her legs give out from relief. Emily wrapped her arms around her, and for the first time in hours, Caroline allowed herself to believe they might actually survive this nightmare. But one question remained unanswered. What had happened to Richard? They didn't have to wait long to find out. As they climbed back up to the deck, now swarming with Coast Guard and FBI agents, they found Viktor Kozlov in custody, his men either arrested or down, but near the railing where the two men had fought. A dark stain spread across the deck. Richard was gone. An FBI agent approached them, his expression grim. "Ma'am, we need to ask you some questions about Richard Sullivan. But first, I need to tell you, he went overboard during the struggle. We have rescue boats searching. But he didn't need to finish. In these dark waters, after that fall, there would be no rescue." Caroline looked at Emily, saw the complex mix of emotions on her daughter's face. Relief, sadness, and something that might have been closure. "Is he dead?" Emily asked quietly. "We don't know for certain," the agent replied honestly, "but the chances of survival are very slim." Emily nodded slowly, then looked up at Caroline. "Can we go home now, Mom? The real home? Not the one he left behind, but the one we built without him." Caroline smiled through her tears and pulled her daughter close. "Yes, sweetheart. We can go home." 6 months later, the Miami morning sun streamed through the windows of Caroline's new apartment, casting warm golden light across the breakfast table, where Emily sat working on her laptop, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration as she typed. At 14 now, she'd grown 2 inches and developed a confidence that sometimes took Caroline's breath away. "Mom, did you know that Viktor Kozlov got life in prison without parole?" Emily said, looking up from her screen. "It's in all the news articles about the trial." Caroline paused in packing Emily's lunch, a familiar tightness forming in her chest. Even 6 months later, mentions of that night on the Ocean Majesty could still transport her back to the deck, the helicopter rotors, the sound of gunshots echoing across the water. "I saw that," Caroline replied carefully. "How do you feel about it?" Emily considered this with the thoughtfulness she'd developed since that terrible night, a maturity that Caroline sometimes worried had come too early, bought with too high a price. Relieved, mostly, and kind of sad for him, which is weird because he was going to kill us. She closed the laptop and looked directly at Caroline. "Do you think Richard is really dead?" It was a question Emily asked periodically, usually when something triggered a memory or when she'd been researching the case online. The Coast Guard had searched for 3 days before officially calling off the rescue operation. Richard's body was never found, but the water temperature and the fall from that height made survival virtually impossible according to the experts. "I think," Caroline said slowly, "that Richard Sullivan died the night he decided to fake his death and abandon his family 13 years ago. Whatever happened to that man on the ship, the person who was your father was already gone." Emily nodded, seeming satisfied with that answer. "Victoria called yesterday while you were at work. She wanted to know if we're still coming to her gallery opening next week." Caroline smiled at the mention of Victoria Whitmore, or Victoria Chen now, having reclaimed her mother's maiden name along with her independence. The socialite who had once seemed so fragile had revealed a core of steel that impressed everyone who knew her story. With Kozlov's organization dismantled and Richard's fraudulent claims to her fortune exposed, Victoria had used her resources to establish a foundation helping victims of financial fraud. "Of course we're going. She's worked so hard to put that exhibition together." The exhibition, titled Stolen Lives, Art Therapy for Trauma Survivors, featured work by women who'd been victimized by predators like Richard. Caroline had contributed a quilt she'd sewn during the sleepless nights following their return to Miami, a complex pattern of broken chains transforming into soaring birds that had taken her 4 months to complete. Emily picked up her backpack, now heavy with textbooks from the prestigious private school Victoria's foundation had helped fund. The scholarship covered everything, but more importantly, it had given Emily access to counselors who specialized in helping children process complex trauma. "I'll be late tonight," Emily said, kissing Caroline's cheek. "Drama club is rehearsing until 6, and then I'm having dinner with the Hendersons." The Hendersons were Emily's best friend Sarah's family, the kind of normal, stable household Caroline had always dreamed of providing, but never quite managed during their years of struggle. Emily had been invited to so many family dinners that Mrs. Henderson jokingly referred to her as their bonus daughter. "Text me when you get to school," Caroline called as Emily headed for the door. "Always do, Mom. Love you." "Love you too." "Sweetheart." The apartment fell quiet after Emily left, but it was a peaceful quiet, not the oppressive silence of loneliness that had characterized so many of Caroline's mornings during the years when she'd worked multiple jobs just to keep food on the table. This apartment was larger than anywhere they'd ever lived, with 2 real bedrooms and windows that looked out over Biscayne Bay. More importantly, it represented stability, safety, and a future that belonged to them. Caroline's phone buzzed with a text from Maggie. "Docking in Port Everglades this afternoon. Dinner tonight if you're free." Caroline smiled as she typed back. "Absolutely." Usual place at 7, Maggie had returned to cruise ship work, but now as a guest services coordinator rather than a housekeeper, a promotion that came with better pay and considerably more respect. She made sure to route her ships through South Florida ports whenever possible, so she could visit Caroline and Emily. The friendship forged in those terrifying hours aboard the Ocean Majesty had deepened into something Caroline treasured, the bond between women who had faced the darkness together and chosen to step into the light. Caroline's own job was another gift that had emerged from the ashes of that nightmare. Victoria's Foundation had hired her as a victim services coordinator, work that used both her natural empathy and her hard-won understanding of what it meant to survive financial and emotional abuse. The pay was better than anything she'd ever earned, but more importantly, the work felt meaningful in a way that serving wealthy cruise passengers never had. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but the area code was local. Caroline Hayes speaking. Mrs. Hayes, this is Detective Rodriguez with Miami-Dade Police. I'm calling about the Richard Sullivan case. Caroline's heart clenched. Has something happened? Did you find... No, ma'am. Nothing like that. I'm calling because we've closed the investigation officially. The FBI has concluded their review of all the evidence, and Mr. Sullivan has been declared legally dead. I wanted to let you know before you heard it on the news. Caroline sank into her kitchen chair. Processing this information, legally dead, it felt appropriate somehow. Richard had been legally dead for 13 years. After all, this just made it official again. What happens now? She asked. Well, there are some financial implications you should be aware of. The life insurance policy Mr. Sullivan took out under his real name was never actually paid out because of questions about the death certificate. Now that we've established he did die on March 15th. He paused. Well, technically, the insurance company owes your family the original benefit plus 13 years of accumulated interest. Caroline blinked. I'm sorry, what? It's a substantial sum, Mrs. Hayes. I'd recommend contacting a lawyer, but you're looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of $800,000. The number was so large Caroline couldn't quite process it. $800,000. After 13 years of struggle, of working multiple jobs, of watching Emily wear secondhand clothes and eat cereal for dinner, Richard's death was finally going to provide the security he'd promised her in life, but never delivered. Mrs. Hayes, are you there? Yes. I'm here, I need to think about this. Of course. I'll email you the contact information for the insurance company and the case number. Take your time. After hanging up, Caroline sat in her sunny kitchen, staring at the bay through her windows. $800,000 would mean Emily could go to any college she wanted. It would mean Caroline could buy this apartment instead of renting it. It would mean true financial security for the first time in either of their lives. But it also meant that Richard's death had finally given them something his life never could. Peace. That evening, Caroline sat in their favorite restaurant with Maggie, watching the sun set over the water as she told her friend about the detective's call. It's like the universe's twisted idea of justice, Caroline mused. He spent 13 years living off stolen money. And now his real death is going to provide for the family he abandoned. Maggie raised her wine glass. To second chances, she said, and to women who are strong enough to build new lives from the ashes of old ones. Caroline clinked her glass against Maggie's. And to daughters who teach their mothers about courage. Speaking of Emily, how is she handling all this closure? Better than I expected. Her therapist says she's processing it all very healthily. She's been writing in a journal, working through her feelings about having a father who was both a victim and a victimizer. Caroline smiled. Yesterday, she told me she wants to study criminal psychology in college. She wants to understand how people become capable of the things Richard did. That girl is going to change the world, Maggie said with conviction. I think she already has, Caroline replied. She changed mine. Later that night, Caroline found Emily curled up in her bedroom with a book, her homework spread out across her desk. The room was decorated with the posters and memorabilia of a normal teenager, but Caroline knew her daughter would never be entirely normal. Trauma like theirs left permanent marks. Invisible scars that would always be part of who Emily became. Hey, Mom, Emily said, looking up from her book. Detective Rodriguez called you today, didn't he? I saw the missed call notification on your phone. Caroline had learned not to lie to Emily about anything related to their ordeal. Honesty, even when painful, had become the foundation of their rebuilt relationship. Yes, they've officially closed Richard's case. He's been declared legally dead. Emily was quiet for a moment, processing this. Does that mean it's really over? I think so. Sweetheart, "I think we can finally put all of this behind us." Emily smiled. Not the cautious, wounded smile she'd worn for months after the cruise, but the bright, genuine expression Caroline remembered from before their world had been turned upside down. "Good," Emily said simply. "I'm ready to just be normal Caroline and Emily Hayes, living our normal life in our normal apartment, with our normal problems that don't involve Russian mobsters or fake identities." Caroline laughed, the sound lighter than it had been in years. "Normal sounds perfect to me." As she kissed Emily goodnight and turned off the light, Caroline looked out at the bay gleaming in the moonlight. Somewhere out there, in those dark waters, Richard Sullivan had finally found the peace that had eluded him for 13 years of running. And here, in this bright apartment filled with hope and possibility, Caroline and Emily had found something even more precious. They had found home.